In this video, we'll be talking about regulation of overall blood pressure and the regulation of blood flow to particular tissues. We'll be talking about these together because pressure and flow are so closely related. We'll talk about both short-term and long-term regulation. In the short term, we're mostly talking about changes in vessel diameter. Vessel diameter is changed moment by moment to control both systemic blood pressure and perfusion of tissues. Heart rate can also be adjusted to immediately regulate blood pressure. Short-term controls work moment by moment to resist fluctuations in pressure. In long-term regulation, blood pressure is maintained by changes in blood volume. The kidneys do this work, controlling how much water is lost in the urine. Blood pressure is the product of cardiac output and resistance. So anything that affects cardiac output or resistance will affect blood pressure. With resistance, we're talking primarily about blood vessel diameter. And there's a whole slew of factors that can affect cardiac output. Heart rate, heart contractility, muscle activity, by affecting how much blood is returning through the veins. Hormonal and autonomic nervous system influences. Changes in blood volume affect cardiac output too. Maintaining adequate blood pressure is vitally important to keeping blood circulating throughout the body. It's critical. But if the blood pressure is too high, of course that can be a problem. It can damage the heart and the arteries as well as other organs. So your body works very, very hard to keep blood pressure stable. The main organs involved are the heart and blood vessels, of course, also the kidneys, and the brain coordinates things. Anytime systemic blood pressure changes, these organs respond to bring it back to normal. First, we'll talk about neural regulation of blood pressure. Neural regulation serves a couple of different purposes. First off, it works to maintain a stable blood pressure, maintaining the mean arterial pressure, which, if you recall, is the pressure that indicates, on average, how well blood can flow to the organs. The neural regulation also works to redistribute blood flow, so it can alter blood distribution to respond to the demands of the organs. So it can control, like, if you have more blood going to your skin or more blood going to your digestive tract or your muscles, help send blood where it needs to be. The main structure in the brain that's involved with this is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata contains vasomotor centers, so clusters of neurons that oversee changes in vessel diameter. They can either stimulate your arterial smooth muscle cells to constrict and close down the blood vessels, or they can stimulate them to, tell them to relax, and allowing blood vessels to open back up. The vasomotor center works together with cardioacceleratory and cardioinhibitor centers that affect heart rate. Cardioacceleratory, of course, contains neurons that increase heart rate, and cardioinhibitory center contains neurons that decrease heart rate. Vasomotor activity can be regulated by higher brain centers like the hypothalamus or the cortex. So if you're thinking about something stressful or having an emotional response, that can affect your vasomotor centers. But it's also regulated by receptors that directly detect what's going on in the blood. These are your baroreceptors and your chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors are pressure receptors. It's the same prefix as in the term barometer. Barometers are used to detect changes in atmospheric pressure. Baroreceptors in your arteries detect changes in blood pressure. Baroreceptors are located in most large arteries of the neck and thorax, but there are particular concentrations of them in the aortic arch and in the carotid arteries. The baroreceptors in the aortic arch monitor blood pressure and make sure that there's a sufficient blood pressure going out into the aorta to feed the systemic circuit. And the baroreceptors in the carotid arteries make sure that there's sufficient blood pressure to feed the brain. These guys protect the circulation to the brain. Remember that blood pressure is the force of blood pushing on an arterial wall, or a blood vessel wall. So these baroreceptors are basically mechanical receptors that detect the way the arterial wall is stretched when blood pressure changes. When blood pressure goes up, the arterial wall is stretched a bit more, and the baroreceptors increase their signaling to the brain. So they get sent to the brain, inhibit the vasomotor center, and that actually leads to vasodilation of the arterioles. Note that it's vasomotor inhibition that leads to dilation. This is why neurogenic shock occurs. If you get brain damage to the medulla oblongata, the vasomotor center isn't sending a signal anymore, so the smooth muscle of your blood vessels relax, and your blood vessels dilates. If in the example of neurogenic shock, they dilate so much and so systemically that your blood pressure falls through the floor. When blood pressure goes up, there's also a coordinated stimulation of the cardiac centers that leads to a reduced heart rate, and that reduced heart rate is going to lower your cardiac output, lowering blood pressure. When blood pressure goes down, you get less stretch on the arterial wall, and the baroreceptors reduce their signaling. This reduction in signaling removes inhibition of the vasomotor center, and the vasomotor center can be more active and stimulate vasoconstriction, and the cardiac centers can stimulate an accelerated heart rate. So vasoconstriction will increase resistance, bring blood pressure back up, and heart rate will increase cardiac output, also bringing blood pressure back up. Next to the baroreceptors, you have the chemoreceptors. The chemoreceptors detect the chemical composition of the blood. Specifically, they detect these: carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH. If blood isn't circulating well, you're going to see an increase in carbon dioxide as carbon dioxide accumulates in that non-circulating blood. You're also going to see a decrease in oxygen as the cells consume the oxygen in the blood. The increase in carbon dioxide leads directly to a decrease in pH, because carbon dioxide combines with water in the blood to form an acid. So all of these indicators, increased carbon dioxide, decreased oxygen, and decreased pH, are indicators of poor circulation, poor blood flow. So when the chemoreceptors detect these conditions, they trigger the cardioacceleratory center, leading to an increase in heart rate, which leads to an increase in cardiac output. They also trigger the vasomotor center, leading to vasoconstriction to bring blood pressure up. These very same receptors, they have an effect on blood pressure, but they're even more important in regulating respiration, so we'll talk more about them when we get to the respiratory system. There are a number of hormones that regulate blood pressure. Norepinephrine, from the sympathetic nervous system stimulation of the adrenal medulla, stimulates vasoconstriction. Epinephrine stimulates vasoconstriction as well and increases cardiac output. So think about that fight or flight response when you see the bear at the back of the room and you start to get that like freaking out sensation. Your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up. And that's due to the vasoconstriction, and it's the increased heart rate that leads to increased cardiac output. Angiotensin 2 is a quicker response that's actually mediated by the kidney. The kidney secretes a hormone called renin that activates angiotensin, and angiotensin increases vasoconstriction. Angiotensin also stimulates aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, which can have longer-lasting effects on blood pressure, increasing blood pressure. Atrial natriuretic peptide is produced by the atria of the heart, that's why they call it atrial natriuretic peptide. this hormone decreases blood volume and blood pressure. It actually inhibits aldosterone, and so it decreases blood volume in part that way. It also causes a generalized vasodilation, which contributes to the reduction in blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone acts on the kidneys, telling the kidneys to conserve water so that if more water is retained in the blood, it brings blood volume up, which increases blood pressure. So that's more of a longer-term response. There's also a more acute effect of antidiuretic hormone. When blood pressure falls to dangerous levels, antidiuretic hormone is released in very high amounts. And high levels of ADH causes vasoconstriction. So it promotes a very intense vasoconstriction when you are having a traumatic drop in blood pressure. Long-term regulation of blood pressure is controlled largely by the kidneys. Basically, if you have an increase in blood volume, you get an increase in blood pressure. But this increase in blood volume tends to be a little bit of a slower response, but it tends to last longer. There are both direct mechanisms by which the kidney increases blood volume and indirect mechanisms. So the kidney acts directly when you have an increase in either blood volume or blood pressure. You get more fluid pushed into the kidney tubules, which means that more fluid is going to be lost as urine. So it's just an immediate mechanical, physical response. Increased blood volume means that you have, remember your capillary pressures, you have more filtration, more water pushed out of the capillaries in the kidney and going into your urine. So that will tend to bring blood volume back down. And the inverse happens when arterial pressure falls. When arterial pressure falls, filtration decreases as well. So you get less water lost in the urine, and blood volume will tend to come back up. The indirect renal mechanism also acts when there's a drop in arterial pressure. You get baroreceptors detecting the drop in blood pressure, telling the kidney to release renin. Renin activates angiotensin 2, which has a number of different effects that all lead to bringing arterial blood pressure back up. To be a bit more specific about the effects of angiotensin 2, there are 4 ways in which angiotensin increases blood pressure. The first is that it's a potent vasoconstrictor, so it actually acts on the blood vessel diameter, constricts the blood vessels, bringing blood pressure back up. It also acts a little bit indirectly by stimulating aldosterone secretion. Aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption from the urine. Through osmosis, water follows sodium back into the blood, so that sodium draws water from the urine back into the blood, so you get less water lost in your urine. Angiotensin also stimulates the posterior pituitary to release ADH, so you get less water lost in your urine. And lastly, angiotensin 2 stimulates thirst, so it makes you want to drink more water. All of these effects are geared towards raising blood pressure. So if you have a problem with high blood pressure, you might be given a drug called an ACE inhibitor. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme, and it's one of the enzymes essential in the activation of angiotensin 2. So if you're given an ACE inhibitor, it decreases production of angiotensin 2, and for some people it's effective in reducing their blood pressure back to levels that their heart can work with. These are sometimes prescribed for hypertension, prescribed after a heart attack, during heart failure, or just to prevent stroke. I want to switch gears now and talk a bit about regulation of tissue flow. So here we're talking about perfusion, and sometimes maintaining stable tissue flow runs counterintuitive to the need to maintain blood pressure. So keep that in mind, that now we're focusing on maintaining perfusion, not necessarily regulating blood pressure. So there are three categories of controls that maintain tissue perfusion. You have metabolic controls, myogenic controls, and longer term you have angiogenesis. Metabolic controls act on the precapillary sphincters, and these are the signals that allow capillary beds to respond, that allow the blood flow through capillary beds to respond to the metabolic needs of the tissue or of the organ. So basically, if you have reduced oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and a reduced pH, remember that these two go together. High carbon dioxide means more acidic pH. All of these signals, they trigger vasodilation. They trigger the precapillary sphincters to relax, opening up, sending more blood through the capillary bed. Now remember that if you have a constricted capillary, you have less flow going through that capillary. But if you have a dilated capillary, if it's bigger, you have more flow. So all of these signals, low oxygen, low acidic pH, high carbon dioxide, these all indicate that you have metabolically active tissue that's not being well served. It's not getting the oxygen that it needs, and it's not getting its carbon dioxide carried away. So the solution is dilate those capillaries, or dilate those arterioles, and send more blood to that tissue. Right? The endothelial cells in the tunica intima of the blood vessels also play a role in regulating tissue flow. There's a balance between the production of endothelins and nitric oxide. Endothelins are a vasoconstrictor, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. Endothelins are produced pretty much continuously, and they're balanced by nitric oxide, and under conditions where you have low oxygen levels and you need more blood flow, nitric oxide production increases, so you get dilation. Also falling into this category of metabolic controls, you have inflammatory cells. If you have an infection or some other kind of inflammation going on, the immune cells in that area will release vasodilators, including histamine, prostaglandins, kinins. These are all inflammatory vasodilators. With the myogenic controls, you're talking about responses that are controlled directly by smooth muscle in the blood vessels. The prefix myo should be a key there to remember that it's the smooth muscle that controls these flows. And these smooth muscle cells, they respond directly to stretch, reflexively to stretch. If you have increased intravascular pressure, that triggers an automatic vasoconstriction. So the smooth muscle cells reflexively contract, constricting the blood vessel when you have increased blood pressure. This is a protective mechanism because increased blood pressure, if there's too much blood flowing through a capillary bed, it can damage the capillaries and it can potentially damage the organs. So if there's increased pressure, that would tend to send more blood into the tissue. But by constricting it, that actually reduces the blood flow, so that blood is shunted off to other capillaries. If you have decreased vascular pressure, that decreases the stretch that the smooth muscle cells detect, and they reflexively relax, leading to vasodilation and increased blood flow. So this response is an attempt to maintain blood flow even when blood pressure falls. Note As I said, sometimes the mechanisms to regulate systemic blood pressure act in opposition to the mechanisms to regulate tissue flow. This is an example of that. When blood pressure falls, your brain tries to vasoconstrict the blood vessels in the body to try and bring systemic blood pressure back up. But if you are just talking at an organ, specifically in an organ, and you want blood pressure maintained to that organ, then you want to dilate when blood pressure falls so that you can still get blood flowing to the organ. Lastly, we have angiogenesis. Angiogenesis is just the production of new blood vessels and the enlargement of existing ones. So angiogenesis is a form of long-term autoregulation. Cancer cells, tumors, are very, very wise in the ways of angiogenesis because tumors are highly metabolically active. They need a lot of new blood vessels. When you have a tissue or an organ that is underserved, that is chronically underserved, it will actually stimulate the growth and enlargement of blood vessels to increase blood flow to that area. There are a few specific organs where blood flow is regulated tightly and that I want to go over. Skeletal muscle is one. Skeletal muscle you have can be very highly metabolically active or not so highly metabolically active. So the amount of metabolic activity in skeletal muscle, of course, varies with the extent you're using it. It varies with your exercise, your activity levels. If you have decreased oxygen, that triggers vasodilation of the capillaries in the skeletal muscle. So if your skeletal muscle is more metabolically active, it's going to be using more oxygen, and that's going to trigger increased blood flow with vasodilation. Also, when your skeletal muscle is not getting enough oxygen, it has to produce ATP anaerobically, and that results in the accumulation of lactic acid. So the capillaries actually respond to lactic acid as well, and that lactic acid triggers vasodilation, again, increasing blood flow, bringing more oxygen to the skeletal muscle that needs it. There's also, when you are exercising, your sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and that sympathetic nervous system activation slows down blood flow to the skin and the viscera so that there's more blood available to flow to the skeletal muscle. The brain is a special case because it's the most metabolically active organ in the body. It needs a lot of nutrients, it needs a lot of oxygen, and it's very sensitive to loss of oxygen. That's what ischemia is loss of oxygen. Ischemia can cause major brain damage, and you need your brain. So blood flow is constantly adjusted according to the needs of the brain. Remember those baroreceptors in the carotid arteries? They monitor blood flow to the brain very closely, or they monitor blood pressure to the brain. If you have increased carbon dioxide, that leads to decreased pH, and that leads to vasodilation. So if you have carbon dioxide accumulating in the brain, you'll get vasodilation. You also have myogenic controls protecting blood flow to the brain. If you have a decrease in your mean arterial pressure, you get vasodilation. So you have, again, this is protecting blood flow to the brain. So if blood pressure drops, you need to make sure that it's easier for blood to get to the brain. So you do vasodilation. Similarly, if blood pressure increases, you don't want to damage the brain from having too much blood flowing there, so you get vasoconstriction. The lungs are a special case because their metabolic autoregulatory controls are the opposite of what they are in the systemic circuit. In the systemic circuit, if you have decreased oxygen, it's an indicator decreased oxygen levels, it's an indicator that you need to send more blood to that area. So decreased oxygen leads to vasodilation in the systemic circuit. In the lungs, The reason why you're sending blood to the lungs is in order to pick up oxygen. So, if there's low levels of oxygen, that actually triggers vasoconstriction of the capillaries in the lungs, because you don't want to send blood to the place where there's no oxygen in the lungs. Remember, vasoconstriction leads to reduced blood flow. So if you have, say, a little pocket in your lungs that isn't getting any air to it, that doesn't have any oxygen in it, you can constrict the capillaries that are wrapping around that pocket so that that blood can go somewhere where there's a lot of oxygen. Just remember, in the lungs, blood goes to the lungs in order to pick up oxygen. So vasodilation, which leads to increased blood flow. Vasodilation is actually a response to higher oxygen levels in the lungs. This is the complete opposite of what's happening in the systemic circuit. Regulation of blood flow to the skin is a little special because it changes in response to body temperatures. The anatomy of the skin, the vascular anatomy, in the skin, you have a lot of what are called AV shunts. So AV shunts are basically vessels that go straight from arterial to venule without passing through a capillary bed. So what happens is that when you're cold and you need to reduce blood flow to the skin, these AV shunts open up and blood passes straight from arterial to venule without actually going through the capillary beds. In the heart, myogenic mechanisms predominate, so that direct, immediate, reflexive, smooth muscle response keeps blood flow to the coronary circulation pretty constant. Also, exercise stimulates vasodilation in the coronary circulation so that you get more blood flow to the myocardium when you're exercising. After studying this video, you should be able to discuss a bit about how blood pressure homeostasis is maintained. Enough blood pressure, but not too much. You should be able to talk about the baroreceptor and chemoreceptor reflexes, and a little bit about what hormones can help control blood pressure. You should be able to address how the body regulates blood pressure in the long term. We'll come back to this when we talk about the urinary system, since the kidneys are so vital for this process. You should also be able to describe the renin-angiotensin system for regulating blood volume and the effects of angiotensin too. Describe the autoregulatory controls at the capillary bed, so the metabolic controls, the myogenic controls, and angiogenesis. And talk a little bit about how blood pressure is regulated in the skeletal muscle, brain, and lungs specifically.